My name is Ethan Carter, and I've always loved the quiet of the wilderness. It's where I feel most alive, or at least it used to be. I'm a wildlife photographer, and my job takes me to places most people wouldn't dare to go. This time, it brought me to a remote forest in the Pacific Northwest. People around here call it Blackwood Forest, and they say it's cursed. I didn't believe in curses, at least not until I came here. The forest was beautiful but eerie. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A thick fog hung low to the ground, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was unnerving. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just stillness. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I was here to photograph rare wildlife, but honestly, I had another reason for coming. After losing my wife and daughter in a car accident last year, I needed an escape. The guilt was eating me alive, and being alone in nature felt like the only way to clear my head. But as I walked deeper into the forest that day, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It began with whispers, soft, distant voices carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard them again. They weren't words exactly, more like murmurs, rising and falling like waves. I stopped in my tracks and looked around, but there was no one there. Shook it off and kept walking, trying to focus on my work. That's when I saw something strange. Claw marks on one of the trees. They were deep and jagged, like something strong had ripped through the bark. I crouched down to examine them closer. They didn't look like they came from any animal I knew. Not a bear or cougar or anything else that lived around here. The fog seemed to thicken as I moved further into the forest. My camera felt heavier around my neck, and every step felt harder than the last. The whispers grew louder now, almost like they were calling my name. Ethan. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest as I spun around, trying to find where the voice had come from. But again, nothing. That's when I realized this wasn't just any forest. Something was wrong here, something unnatural. And yet, I kept walking. The fog was everywhere now, curling around the trees like it had a mind of its own. My breath felt heavy and the air smelled damp and earthy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped to listen, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. Just the fog. I kept moving, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But then I stumbled across something that made my stomach drop. An abandoned campsite. There were 2 tents, both torn open like something had clawed through them. Clothes and backpacks were scattered everywhere, along with pots and pans that looked like they'd been tossed aside in a hurry. I stepped closer and saw something that made my skin crawl. A dark stain on the ground. Blood. It wasn't fresh, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. A trail of smudged footprints led away from the campsite and disappeared into the fog. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking a little. "Is anyone here?" No answer. I wasn't sure what to do. My gut told me to turn back and leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures of the campsite, just in case someone needed evidence later. That's when I heard the sound of snapping branches behind me. I whipped around and saw a figure, emerging from the fog, a woman wearing a ranger's uniform. She looked startled to see me. "What are you doing here?" she asked sharply. "I'm Ethan," I said quickly, holding up my camera as if that explained everything. "I'm a photographer. I found this campsite. It looks like something bad happened here." She frowned and glanced around at the torn tents and scattered belongings. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low but firm. "This forest isn't safe." "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "People go missing here," she said finally, "more than you'd think. And it's not just accidents or getting lost. There's something out there." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "What kind of something?" I asked nervously. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she crouched down and picked up a weathered notebook from the ground near one of the tents. It was stained and dirty, but still readable. "This belonged to one of the missing hikers," she said, flipping through its pages. "He wrote about seeing things in the fog." "What kind of things?" I asked, leaning closer. "Shadowy figures," she said quietly. "Shapes that looked human, but weren't." I felt my heart skip a beat as she handed me the notebook. The handwriting was messy, like whoever wrote it had been in a hurry, or terrified. One entry stood out. "The fog is alive. It moves like it's hunting us. We hear voices at night, calling. Our names, but there's no one there." I swallowed hard and handed the notebook back to her. "Do you think those hikers are still alive?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "No," she said simply. Before I could say anything else, the fog seemed to thicken even more around us, swallowing up what little daylight remained. The trees looked darker now, their shadows stretching long across the ground. "I think we should leave," Mia said suddenly, her name stitched onto her ranger uniform. "I don't know if we can," I replied nervously, pointing at where I'd come from earlier. The trail was gone now, completely hidden by the fog. Mia's face tightened as she looked around us, her hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight strapped to her belt. And then we heard it. A low growl coming from somewhere deep in the mist. It wasn't an animal growl. It sounded wrong somehow, like it came from something pretending to be an animal but failing miserably. "We need to move," Mia whispered urgently, grabbing my arm and pulling me forward. "Stay close." The growls grew louder as we walked quickly through the forest, our footsteps crunching against fallen leaves and twigs. And then came another sound. Voices again, distorted and echoing through the fog. "Ethan." One voice called softly, "Mia." Another voice followed. We both froze in place as chills ran down our spines. "They know our names," Mia whispered shakily. I didn't know what to say, or what to do. But one thing was clear. Whatever was out there wasn't human. Mia and I moved quickly through the forest, our steps hurried but quiet. The fog was so thick now that we could barely see a few feet ahead. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional snap of a branch. But it wasn't just us making noise. There were other sounds too. Footsteps, heavy ones, and they weren't far behind. "Don't look back," Mia whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Just keep moving." I wanted to ask her what she thought was following us, but I didn't dare speak. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The growling we'd heard earlier was closer now, and it wasn't alone. There were multiple growls, low and guttural, coming from all directions. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something darting between the trees to our left. It was fast. Too fast to get a good look at. But I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human-like. "Mia," I whispered, my voice shaking. "There's something out there." "I know," she said without looking at me. She was gripping her flashlight tightly now, her knuckles white. The growling turned into a strange clicking sound, like bones snapping or teeth chattering together. It echoed through the forest, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. And then we saw them. At first, they were just shadows in the fog, tall, thin shapes moving unnaturally between the trees. But as they got closer, their features became clearer. They looked almost human, but not quite. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were pale and stretched, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly. In the dim light, I froze in place, unable to move or even breathe. One of them stepped closer, its head tilting to the side like it was studying us. Its mouth opened slowly, revealing sharp teeth that didn't belong in any human mouth. "Run!" Mia shouted, snapping me out of my trance. We took off through the forest, dodging trees and jumping over roots as fast as we could. The creatures followed us, their distorted voices calling our names over and over again. Ethan. Mia. The way they said our names sent chills down my spine. It wasn't just creepy. It felt personal, like they knew us somehow. We ran until we stumbled upon an old cabin hidden deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, its windows broken and its wooden walls covered in moss, but it was our only option. In. "Here!" Mia yelled, pulling me inside. She slammed the door shut behind us and shoved a heavy wooden table against it for good measure. We stood there for a moment, catching our breath and listening for any signs that the creatures had followed us. The forest outside had gone eerily silent again. "Do you think they're gone?" I asked quietly. Mia shook her head. "No," she said grimly. "They're never gone." The cabin was small and dark, with only a few broken chairs and an old fireplace inside. The walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols I didn't recognize and words written in a language I couldn't read. "What is this place?" I asked, running my fingers over one of the carvings. "It's been here for years," Mia said softly. "People used to come here to protect themselves." "From what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The Mistwalkers," she said quietly. I stared at her in disbelief. "Mistwalkers? What are you talking about?" She hesitated before answering. "It's just a name people around here use," she said finally. "They're cursed beings. They were human once, but something happened to them, something that turned them into monsters." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as her words sank in. "They feed on fear," Mia continued, "and guilt." I looked away quickly, not wanting her to see the expression on my face. My guilt over losing my wife and daughter had been eating me alive for months now, and if these creatures could sense that— "They can't come inside," Mia said suddenly, interrupting my thoughts. "What?" I asked. "These symbols on the walls," she explained, gesturing at the carvings around us. "They're meant to keep them out." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something about this place felt wrong, too. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like it was alive, swirling and shifting as if searching for a way in. And then came the knocking. 3 slow taps on the door. We both froze in place as chills ran down our spines. "Ethan," a voice called softly from outside. It sounded familiar. Too familiar. It sounded like my wife's voice. The voice outside the cabin sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be her. My wife had been gone for over a year, and yet the way it called my name was unmistakable. "Ethan." I backed, away from the door, shaking my head. "No," I whispered to myself. "It's not real." Mia grabbed my arm, her grip firm. "Don't listen to it," she said urgently. "It's not her. It's them." "How do they know her voice?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They know everything about you," Mia replied grimly. "Your fears, your regrets. They use them against you." I felt sick to my stomach. My guilt had been a constant weight on me since the accident. I thought coming to this forest would help me escape it, but now it felt like the Mistwalkers were feeding off it, like they could sense every dark thought I'd ever had. The knocking came again, louder this time. "Ethan," the voice called. Again, softer now, almost pleading. I clenched my fists and turned away from the door. "I can't do this," I said quietly. "I can't stay here." "You don't have a choice," Mia said firmly. "If you open that door, you won't survive." I looked at her, desperate for answers. "How do we stop them?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "Fire," she said finally. "They hate fire and light. It weakens them." I glanced at the old fireplace in the corner of the cabin. It was empty, but there was a pile of dry wood nearby. Without thinking, I rushed over and started stacking the wood inside. "What are you doing?" Mia asked. "We need light," I said quickly. If fire keeps them away, then we need as much of it as we can get. Mia nodded and grabbed an old box of matches from one of the shelves. She struck one and lit the wood, and within seconds, flames roared to life in the fireplace. The warm glow filled the cabin, pushing back some of the darkness that had been closing in around us. For a moment I felt safer, but only for a moment. The voices outside grew louder now, more insistent. "Mia," one of them called. "Ethan," and then came the scratching, the sound of claws dragging across the wooden walls of the cabin. "They're trying to get in," Mia said quietly. I swallowed hard and stared at the flickering flames in the fireplace, trying to focus on anything other than what was happening outside. But then something happened that made my heart stop. The voice changed again, and this time it wasn't just calling my name. Daddy. I froze in place as tears welled up in my eyes. It sounded like my daughter's voice, sweet and innocent, just like I remembered it. "No," I whispered shakily. "It's not real." But hearing her voice brought everything back. The accident, the guilt, the pain that never went away. "Daddy, please." The desperation in her voice was unbearable. It sounded like she was crying, like she needed me to save her. I stood up suddenly and moved toward the door. "Ethan!" Mia shouted, grabbing my arm again. "Don't!" "She's out." "There!" I yelled back at her, tears streaming down my face. "My daughter is out there." "No," Mia said firmly, pulling me back toward the fireplace. "It's not her. They're trying to trick you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but deep down I knew she was right. My daughter was gone, but hearing her voice made me want to believe otherwise. "They're using your guilt against you," Mia said softly but urgently. "You can't let them win." I sank to the floor near the fireplace, burying my face in my hands as sobs racked my body. The voices outside continued calling our names, but now they sounded angry, like they knew we weren't falling for their tricks. And then came another sound, a loud crash from somewhere deeper in the forest. Mia stood up quickly and grabbed her flashlight again. "They're moving closer," she said nervously. "What do we do?" I asked weakly. She looked at me with determination in her eyes. "We fight," she said simply. Before I could respond, there was another crash, this time much closer, and then silence again. Mia. Her name echoed through the fog outside like a warning, and then suddenly, without any warning at all, the window shattered. The window shattered with an ear-splitting crash, and shards of glass scattered across the cabin floor. I scrambled backward, my heart racing as the cold fog poured in like smoke. Mia grabbed a piece of wood from the fireplace, the flames licking at its edges, and held it out like a weapon. "They're here," she said, her voice shaking but steady. Through the broken window, I saw them, those twisted figures lurking just outside. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their movements were jerky, unnatural. One of them stepped closer, its long fingers gripping the edge of the broken window frame. Its face was stretched into a grotesque grin, teeth sharp and glinting in the firelight. "Ethan," it whispered, dragging out my name like it was savoring every syllable. I stood frozen, unable to move or think. But Mia wasn't waiting. She swung the burning wood at the creature's hand, and it let out a horrible screech, a sound so high-pitched and unnatural that it made my ears ring. "Fireworks!" Mia shouted. "Keep it burning!" I grabbed another piece of wood from the pile by the fireplace and lit it quickly. The flames felt like a lifeline, something solid to hold on to in this nightmare. I swung it toward another creature that was clawing at the door, and it shrieked and backed away into the fog. But they weren't giving up. The voices grew louder now, overlapping each other in a chaotic chorus. "Ethan, Mia, Daddy." They were everywhere, scratching at the walls, banging on the door, peering through the broken window. The cabin felt like it was shrinking around us, closing in under their relentless attack. "We can't stay here," Mia yelled over the noise. They'll break through eventually. Where do we go? I asked desperately. She pointed toward a trapdoor in the corner of the cabin floor. There's a cellar, she said. It might buy us some time. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my burning piece of wood and followed her as she yanked open the trapdoor and climbed down into the dark space below. It smelled damp and musty, but at least it felt safer than being upstairs. We pulled the trapdoor, shut behind us just as we heard another crash, the sound of the cabin door splintering open. They're inside, Mia whispered. I held my breath as we listened to heavy footsteps above us, slow and deliberate, like they were searching for us. The voices had stopped now, replaced by eerie silence except for those footsteps. And then came something worse. The sound of breathing. Deep, ragged breaths that seemed to fill the entire cabin above us. They're close, Mia whispered shakily. I gripped my burning wood tightly, even though the flames were starting to die down. My hands were shaking so badly I thought I might drop it. Suddenly there was a loud thud against the trapdoor above us. A single strike that made dust fall from the ceiling of the cellar. They know we're here, Mia said quietly. I looked, around desperately for something, anything that could help us fight back or escape. That's when I noticed something strange in one corner of the cellar. An old metal box covered in symbols similar to those carved on the cabin walls. What's that? I asked Mia. She frowned and moved closer to examine it. It's a trap, she said slowly. Someone left this here. A trap? For what? I asked nervously. For them, she replied grimly. Inside the box were old supplies, matches, flammable liquid, and what looked like pieces of dynamite wrapped tightly together. It's risky, Mia said hesitantly. But if we can lure them all into one place, we can end this, I finished for her. Mia nodded slowly, though her face was pale with fear. It's our only chance. We worked quickly, setting up the trap near one corner of the cellar where we could escape, through another small hatch leading outside. The plan was simple. Draw them down here with fire and light, and then set off the explosives once they were all inside. As soon as everything was ready, Mia lit one of her pieces of wood again and opened the trap door slightly to let out some light. Almost immediately, we heard movement above. The creatures were coming closer. They descended into the cellar one by one. Those twisted figures with glowing eyes and sharp teeth, and every step they took felt like thunder in my chest. They moved toward us slowly but deliberately, their grins wide and sinister. I held my breath as they surrounded us completely, and then nodded at Mia. Now, she yelled, and threw her burning wood onto the explosives. The blast was deafening. A fiery explosion that shook the entire cabin above us and sent flames roaring through every corner of the cellar. The creatures let out horrible screams as they were consumed by fire, but those screams didn't last long. When everything went quiet again, all that was left was smoke and ash. And silence. Mia and I climbed out through the hatch into fresh air just as dawn broke over Blackwood Forest. The fog was gone now, burned away completely, and for once everything felt still again. But as we walked away from that cursed place together, I thought I heard something faint behind me. A whisper, carried by the wind. Ethan. My name is Maria Vasquez, and I've always been drawn to mysteries. Maybe it's because I grew up reading too many detective novels, or maybe it's because life has a way of pulling you toward the things you fear most. Either way, I never thought I'd end up here, standing on the edge of Echo Lake, staring into its dark, still waters. Echo Lake wasn't like any other lake I'd seen before. It wasn't the kind of place people came to for picnics or fishing trips. No, this lake had a reputation, a bad one. People called it cursed, haunted even. There were stories about people disappearing here, about strange lights flickering over the water at night, and whispers that you could hear voices calling your name if you stood too close to the shore. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. Not really. I was a researcher, someone who believed in facts and evidence. But something about Echo Lake made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't explain. The air felt heavier here, like it pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. Even the trees around the lake seemed different. Taller, darker, their branches curling like they were trying to reach out and grab you. I'd been sent here to investigate the lake's strange history. Over the past year, 3 people had drowned in Echo Lake under mysterious circumstances. The weird part? All of them were experienced swimmers and their bodies were never found. The local authorities were stumped and rumors were spreading fast. Rumors about something living in the water. As I stood there that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint sound that almost sounded like laughter. I shook my head and told myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew this place was different. And whatever secrets it was hiding, I was about to find out. I guess I should tell you a little about myself. Like I said, my name is Maria Vasquez. I'm 32 years old, and I work as an independent investigator. My job is to look into strange cases, things that don't make sense or that people are too scared to deal with. Most of the time, it's nothing more than urban legends or misunderstandings. But every now and then, I come across something real, something that makes my skin crawl. I didn't always do this kind of work. A few years ago, I was a marine biologist. I loved the ocean, the way it felt endless and full of life. But then, something happened that changed everything. My younger brother Daniel went missing during a diving trip. He was only 19. One minute he was there, and the next, gone. The search teams never found his body. They said it was probably an accident, but I never believed that. After Daniel disappeared, I couldn't go back to my old life. I quit my job and started looking into cases like his, cases where people vanished without a trace. At first, it was just a way to cope with my grief, but over time, it became something more. It became my purpose. That's how I ended up at Echo Lake. The local sheriff had called me after the 3rd drowning. He said they'd searched the lake for weeks but hadn't found anything. No bodies, no clues, nothing. He sounded desperate, like he didn't know what else to do. "You're our last hope," he told me over the phone. I didn't feel like anyone's last hope, but I agreed to take the case anyway. Maybe it was because of Daniel, because part of me still hoped that solving these mysteries would somehow bring me closer to him. As I stood by the lake that evening watching the last rays of sunlight fade away, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. This wasn't just another case for me. This felt personal. I took a deep breath and turned back toward my car to grab my gear. It was time to get to work. The first thing I did was talk to some of the locals. People in small towns always know, more than they let on, especially about places like Echo Lake. But getting them to talk wasn't easy. Most of them avoided the subject entirely, like just saying the lake's name would bring bad luck. I managed to find one man who was willing to talk. Mr. Harris, the owner of a small bait shop near the lake. He was in his 60s, with a face that looked like it had seen too many storms. When I asked him about the drownings, he shook his head and muttered something under his breath. "People don't just drown in Echo Lake," he said finally, his voice low and serious. "They disappear." I leaned closer. "Disappear? What do you mean?" He glanced around the shop like he was making sure no one else could hear us. "I've lived here my whole life," he said, "and I've seen things I can't explain. Lights over the water at night, shadows moving under the surface, even when there's no wind to stir the waves." I felt a chill run down my spine, but tried to keep my voice steady. "Do you think it's something in the lake? Something alive?" Harris hesitated before answering. "I don't know what it is," he said finally, "but whatever it is, It's not natural. That wasn't exactly comforting. I thanked Harris for his time and left the shop with more questions than answers. If what he said was true, then this case was going to be harder and much stranger than I'd expected. The next day, I decided to visit the families of the victims. It wasn't easy talking to them. Their grief hung in the air like a heavy fog. But I needed to know more about what had happened. Each story was eerily similar. The victims had all gone swimming alone at night, something none of them usually did. One woman told me her husband had been acting strange in the days before he disappeared, like he was hearing things no one else could hear. He kept saying, he heard voices calling him, she said, her hands trembling as she spoke. He said they sounded familiar. That detail stuck with me. Voices calling people into the water? It sounded ridiculous, but there had to be some explanation. By the time I finished my interviews, I felt more uneasy than ever. Whatever was happening at Echo Lake, it wasn't just accidents or bad luck. There was something else going on here, something that didn't make sense. That night, as I sat by my motel window staring out at the dark sky, I couldn't stop thinking about those voices. What if they were real? What if there really was something in the lake? Something waiting for its next victim? I didn't want to believe it. But deep down, I knew I had to find out. The next morning, I decided it was time to get closer to the lake. I packed my gear, a flashlight, waterproof notebook, camera, and a small drone for aerial shots. I wasn't sure what I was looking for yet, but I knew I needed to see the lake up close. When I arrived, the place was eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked toward the shore. The water was perfectly still, like glass, reflecting the gray sky above. It felt wrong somehow, like the lake was holding its breath. I set up my drone first. As it buzzed into the air, I watched the live feed on my tablet. The view from above didn't show much, just endless water surrounded by thick trees. But then, something caught my eye. Near the center of the lake, there was a faint ripple even though there wasn't any wind. It was subtle, almost like something had brushed against the surface. I zoomed in on the camera but couldn't see anything unusual. Still, it made me uneasy. After retrieving the drone, I decided to walk along the shoreline. The ground was soft and muddy, and every step felt heavier than the last. As I moved closer to one of the spots where a victim had disappeared, I noticed something strange. A cluster of dead fish washed up on the shore. Their bodies were bloated and pale, their eyes clouded over. I crouched down to get a better look. There were no visible injuries on them, no bite marks or signs of disease. It was like they'd just stopped living. I took a few pictures and stood up quickly, brushing my hands against my jeans. The air around me felt colder now, and a faint smell of decay lingered in the breeze. That's when I heard it, the sound of water splashing behind me. I froze in place, every muscle in my body tensing up. Slowly, I turned around and scanned the lake. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, there it was. A shadow moved under the surface of the water, not a fish or a wave, but something bigger. It glided smoothly across the lake before disappearing into deeper water. My heart raced as I stared at the spot where it had vanished. What was that? A large animal? A trick of light? Or something else? I wanted to believe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Something was in that lake. Something that didn't belong there. I backed away from the shore and returned to my car as quickly as possible. As I drove back to my motel, my mind raced with possibilities. Could this shadow be connected to the drownings? Was it responsible for those dead fish? And if so, what exactly was it? That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that Echo Lake wasn't just dangerous. It was alive. And whatever lived in its depths wasn't going to let me leave without answers. The next morning, I woke up feeling restless. My dreams had been filled with images of the lake, its dark waters, the shadow moving beneath the surface, and those lifeless fish staring back at me. I knew I couldn't let fear stop me. If I wanted answers, I had to dig deeper. I decided to visit the town's library to see if there was any history about Echo Lake that could explain what was happening. The librarian, Mrs. Carter, was an older woman with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor. When I asked her about the lake, her expression changed. She looked uneasy, like she didn't want to talk about it. "There's not much written about Echo Lake," she said softly. "But there are stories." "What kind of stories?" I asked. Mrs. Carter hesitated before answering. "Old legends," she said finally. "The kind people don't talk about anymore." She led me to a dusty corner of the library and handed me an old leather-bound book. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was faded but still legible. As I flipped through it, I found a section about Echo Lake. According to the book, the lake had been considered sacred by the indigenous people who lived in the area centuries ago. They believed it was home to a powerful spirit, a water entity, that could lure people into its depths. The spirit was said to be both beautiful and dangerous, capable of taking on different forms to trick its victims. One passage stood out to me. "The water spirit calls to those who are lost or broken, promising peace but delivering only darkness." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. Could this water spirit be real? Was it responsible for the drownings? I spent hours in the library piecing together bits of information from old records and local folklore. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Echo Lake wasn't just cursed. It was alive in some way. That evening, I returned to the lake with my notebook and camera. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water. As I stood by the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I decided to test a theory. If there really was something in the lake, something intelligent, I needed to see how it reacted to movement or sound. I picked up a small rock and tossed it into the water. It made a soft splash before sinking beneath the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, there it was. The shadow appeared again, gliding smoothly through the water like it was searching for something. It moved closer to the shore this time, close enough that I could see faint ripples trailing behind it. My heart pounded as I grabbed my camera and started filming. The shadow circled near where I'd thrown the rock before disappearing into deeper water again. I couldn't explain what I'd just seen. It wasn't a fish or any animal I recognized. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly what it was doing. As darkness fell, I packed up my gear and headed back to my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. Whatever was in that lake, it wasn't just dangerous, it was intelligent. And somehow, it knew I was there. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow moving under the water. It wasn't just a shape. It felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to come back. I knew I couldn't avoid the lake. If I wanted answers, I had to face whatever was hiding in its depths. The next morning, I decided to take things a step further. I contacted a local diving expert named Jake. He'd worked with search and rescue teams before and knew the lake. Well, when I told him about the drownings and what I'd seen, he didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Echo Lake's always been strange," he said. "I've heard stories about it since I was a kid, but if you want to dive, we'll need to be careful." Jake agreed to help me explore the lake, but he insisted we bring backup. His friend Sarah joined us, a skilled diver who had worked on similar cases before. Together, we planned to dive near the center of the lake where the shadow had appeared. As we prepared our gear by the shore, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky was overcast and the wind carried a faint smell of decay. Jake noticed it too. "Something's off," he muttered, tightening his wetsuit. Be ready for anything. We entered the water slowly, our movements careful and deliberate. The coldness of the lake seeped through my wetsuit, making my skin prickle. As we swam deeper, the world above faded away, replaced by murky darkness. Atihi. First, everything seemed normal, or as normal as it could be in a place like this. The water was still and silent except for the sound of our breathing through the regulators. But then, things started to change. The deeper we went, the darker it got. Even with our flashlights cutting through the gloom, the water felt thicker somehow, like it was pressing against us. And then we saw them, bones scattered across the lake bed. They weren't human bones, at least not all of them, but they were large enough to make my stomach turn. Fish skeletons mixed with other remains that looked too big to belong to any animal I recognized. Sarah pointed at something ahead, a strange formation rising from the lake bed. It looked like an old stone altar covered in moss and algae. As we swam closer, I noticed carvings on its surface, symbols that matched what I'd seen in the library book about the water spirit. That's when it happened. A sudden current swept through the water, pulling us toward the altar. It wasn't natural. There was no wind or movement above that could explain it. Jake grabbed my arm and signaled for us to retreat, but before we could move, something emerged from the shadows. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It was a figure. At first glance, it looked human. A woman with long flowing hair that shimmered like silver in our flashlight beams. But her eyes, they were empty. Black holes that seemed to swallow light itself. She didn't swim toward us. She glided effortlessly through the water as if she were part of it. Her movements were slow but deliberate, her gaze fixed on me. I felt frozen in place, unable to move or think clearly. Her presence was overwhelming, beautiful and terrifying all at once. Jake shouted something through his regulator and grabbed my arm again, pulling me away from her. Sarah followed close behind as we swam upward as fast as we could. The figure didn't chase us, but she didn't disappear either. She lingered near the altar, watching us until we broke through the surface of the water, gasping for air. Back on shore, none of us spoke for a long time. The silence between us was heavy with fear and confusion. "What was that?" Sarah finally whispered. I shook my head, still trying to catch my breath. "I don't know," I said quietly. "But whatever it is, it's not human." After what we saw in the lake, I knew we couldn't keep this to ourselves. Whatever was down there wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. If we didn't warn people, more lives would be lost. Jake, Sarah, and I drove straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Collins was a middle-aged man with a tired face and a skeptical attitude. When I told him about the figure we'd seen underwater, he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly. "You're telling me there's some kind of creature in Echo Lake?" "It's not just a creature," I said firmly. "It's intelligent. It knows we're here." The sheriff sighed and rubbed his temples. "Look, I've heard stories about the lake my whole life, but I can't shut it down based on a couple of shadows and some spooky carvings." Jake stepped forward, his voice steady but urgent. "This isn't just a story. We saw it with our own eyes. If you don't do something, more people are going to die." Sheriff Collins hesitated, then finally nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll issue a warning to stay away from the lake for now. But if you want me to take this seriously, you're going to need proof." Proof. That meant going back to the lake. The thought made my stomach turn, but I knew he was right. Without evidence, no one would believe us. That evening, the sheriff put up signs around the lake warning people to stay away. But as I drove past the shore, I saw something that made my heart sink. Families were still picnicking near the water, kids were playing by the edge, and fishermen were casting their lines like nothing had changed. They didn't believe the warnings. To them, Echo Lake was just another quiet spot in their small town, a place they'd grown up visiting without fear. I wanted to stop them, to shout at them to leave, but I knew it wouldn't work. People don't listen until it's too late. And that night, it was too late. The first call came around midnight. A frantic woman reported that her husband had gone swimming in the lake and hadn't come back. The second call came an hour later. A group of teenagers had been camping by the shore when they heard strange noises and saw lights over the water. By dawn, 3 people were missing. Sheriff Collins called me early that morning, his voice tense, over the phone. "We've got a situation," he said simply. When I arrived at the lake, it was chaos. Rescue teams were searching the water while families of the missing stood by the shore crying and shouting for answers. Jake and Sarah joined me as we watched from a distance. The air felt heavy again, thicker than before, and the water looked darker somehow, like it was hiding something just beneath its surface. One of the rescue divers surfaced suddenly, gasping for air and shouting at his team to pull him out of the water. "There's something down there," he yelled, his voice shaking with fear. "It's not safe." The other divers hesitated, but eventually climbed out of the water too. They looked pale and shaken as they spoke quietly among themselves. I approached one of them, a young man named Eric, and asked what he'd seen. "It wasn't clear," he said nervously, "but it felt like something was moving around us. It wasn't fish or debris. It was bigger." I exchanged a worried glance with Jake and Sarah. Whatever was in that lake wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. That night, as I sat in my motel room staring at my notes, I realized something chilling. The entity wasn't just attacking random people, it was choosing them. The victims all had something in common. They were vulnerable in some way, grieving a loss, struggling with guilt or regret, broken souls drawn to the lake by promises of peace. But instead of peace, they found darkness. I didn't know how to stop it yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Echo Lake wasn't just dangerous anymore, it was hungry. I felt like I was losing control. No matter what I did, the lake kept pulling people in. It wasn't just the drownings, it was the way the survivors talked about hearing voices, seeing shadows, feeling like they were being watched. Echo Lake wasn't just dangerous anymore. It was alive. And it was winning. I spent hours trying to figure out what to do next. My motel room was covered in notes, maps, photos, and sketches of the symbols we'd seen on the altar. But none of it made sense. How do you fight something you can't even understand? Jake and Sarah were just as frustrated as I was. "We need to go back," Jake said one evening as we sat around a table covered in research. "We need to get closer to that altar." Sarah shook her head, her voice sharp with fear. "Are you kidding me? That thing nearly killed us last time." Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. "If we don't figure out what's going on, more people are going to die." I stayed quiet, staring at the map of Echo Lake spread out in front of me. He was right. If we didn't stop this thing, it would keep taking people. But the thought of going back into that water made my chest tighten with fear. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the figure in the water, her empty black eyes staring at me like she knew everything about me. Like she knew my secrets. And maybe she did. The next morning, I woke up feeling different. Like something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just scared anymore, I was angry. Angry at the lake for taking so many lives, angry at myself for not being able to stop it, angry at the world for letting this happen. I decided to go back to Echo Lake alone. Jake and Sarah tried to stop me when they found out. "You can't do this by yourself," Sarah said urgently. "It's too dangerous." "I don't have a choice," I said quietly. "This isn't just about the lake anymore. It's about me." They didn't understand what I meant, and honestly, I wasn't sure I did either. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just another case for me. This was personal. As I drove toward the lake that evening, the sky turned dark and stormy. The wind whipped through the trees, making them sway like they were alive. The air felt heavier than ever, like it was pressing down on me, warning me to turn back. But I didn't. When I reached the shore, I stood there for a long moment staring at the water. It looked calm on the surface, but I knew better now. Beneath, that calmness was something ancient and powerful, something that wanted me to come closer. I took a deep breath and stepped into the water. At first, nothing happened. The lake felt cold against my skin as I waded deeper and deeper until it reached my waist. The world around me seemed quieter now, like even the wind had stopped moving. Then, I heard it, a voice calling my name. It wasn't loud or harsh. It was soft and familiar, like someone whispering in my ear, but there was no one else here. Maria! I froze in place as chills ran down my spine. The voice sounded like Daniel, my brother who had disappeared years ago during that diving trip. Maria, come closer. Tears filled my eyes as memories of Daniel flooded back. The way he used to laugh when we played together as kids. The way he always looked out for me no matter what. For a moment, I almost believed it was him. That somehow, he'd been trapped here all this time waiting for me to find him. But then I remembered what Mrs. Carter had said about the water spirit. It calls to those who are lost or broken. This wasn't Daniel. It couldn't be. I clenched my fists and shouted into the darkness around me. "You're not him! You're not real!" The voice stopped suddenly, and then everything changed. The water around me began to ripple violently, as shadows appeared beneath the surface again. But this time, there were more of them. They moved faster now, circling around me like predators closing in on their prey. I turned and ran toward the shore as fast as I could, stumbling through the water until I finally reached dry land, gasping for air. When I looked back at the lake, it was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed inside me now. I wasn't just scared anymore. I was ready to fight back. I knew I couldn't keep running. Whatever was in the lake wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. And somehow, I felt like I was part of its plan. It wasn't just hunting random people, it was hunting me. The next day, I called Jake and Sarah. "We need to go back," I said, my voice steady but firm. "This time we're not just looking for answers, we're stopping it." Jake hesitated but nodded. "If we're doing this, we need a plan." Sarah looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You saw what it can do," she said sharply. "How are we supposed to stop something like that?" I didn't have an answer, not yet, but I knew we had to try. That evening, we returned to Echo Lake with more gear than before. Underwater cameras, stronger flashlights, and a small sonar device Jake had borrowed from a friend. The air felt colder than usual as we stood by the shore, preparing for the dive. "I don't like this," Sarah muttered as she adjusted her wetsuit. "This place feels wrong." She wasn't wrong. The lake seemed different now, angrier somehow, like it knew what we were planning. We entered the water slowly, our movements careful and deliberate. As the cold seeped through my wetsuit, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. This time, we weren't just exploring. We were confronting whatever was down there. The deeper we went, the darker it got. Our flashlights cut through the murky water, revealing more of the strange carvings on the rocks below. The sonar device beeped softly as Jake monitored the readings. "There's something big moving," he said suddenly, his voice tense through the communicator. "It's heading toward us." I gripped my flashlight tightly as shadows began to appear around us again, more than before. They moved faster now, circling us like they were trying to trap us. Then she appeared. The figure from before emerged from the darkness, her long, silver hair flowing around her like smoke in the water. But this time, she wasn't alone. Dozens of other shapes followed her, figures that looked human but weren't. Their bodies were twisted and distorted, their faces pale and lifeless. They surrounded us completely, blocking any chance of escape. I felt panic rising in my chest as the figure moved closer to me again. Her empty black eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. "Maria," she whispered, softly, her voice echoing in my mind like a song I couldn't escape. I tried to look away but couldn't. Her presence was overwhelming, beautiful and terrifying all at once. Jake shouted something through his communicator, snapping me out of my trance. "Move, now!" We swam upward as fast as we could, dodging the shadows that reached for us with claw-like hands. The water churned violently around us as if the lake itself was trying to pull us back down. When we finally broke through the surface, gasping for air, I realized something chilling. The shadows hadn't followed us out of the water. They didn't need to. As we climbed onto shore, panting and shaking from fear, the ground beneath us began to tremble slightly. As if something deep below was waking up, Sarah grabbed my arm tightly and pointed toward the lake. "Look!" she shouted. The water was bubbling now, boiling almost, as waves crashed against the shore despite there being no wind or movement above. And then, it happened. A massive shape rose from the center of Echo Lake, a towering figure made entirely of water and shadows. It wasn't just one entity anymore. It was all of them combined into something monstrous and unstoppable. Its form shifted constantly, one moment looking human-like with glowing eyes, the next resembling a creature with tentacles reaching toward us like they wanted to drag us back into its depths. It let out a low rumbling sound that shook the ground beneath our feet, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt deep in our bones. Realized then that this wasn't just a spirit or curse. It was something ancient and powerful beyond anything I'd ever imagined. And it wasn't going to stop until it consumed everything in its path, including us. We stood frozen on the shore, staring at the massive figure rising from the lake. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, its body made of water and shadows, constantly shifting and twisting. It wasn't just alive, it was angry. "What do we do now?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced as I tried to think of something, anything that could stop this thing. But how do you fight something that isn't even solid? Something that isn't bound by the rules of the world we know? Jake grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Maria," he said urgently, "you've been researching this thing for days. There has to be something in all those notes, something we can use." I thought back to everything I'd read, the legends, the carvings, the stories Mrs. Carter had told me. And then it hit me. The altar. The carvings on the altar weren't just decorations. They were instructions. The indigenous people who lived here centuries ago had found a way to bind the entity, to trap it in the lake so it couldn't harm anyone else. But over time, those rituals had been forgotten, and now it was free again. "We need to perform the ritual," I said quickly. "It's the only way to stop it." Sarah looked at me like I was crazy. "A ritual? Are you serious? We don't even know if that will work." "It's our only chance," I said firmly. "If we don't try, more people are going to die." Jake nodded. "What do we need?" I took a deep breath and tried to remember what I'd read in the library book. The ritual required 3 things: fire, earth, and water, all symbols of balance and life. We also needed someone to stand at the altar and speak the words carved into its surface. But there was one more thing: a sacrifice. The book hadn't been clear about what kind of sacrifice was needed, but I had a sinking feeling I already knew. This wasn't going to end without someone paying a price. We gathered what we needed as quickly as possible: candles for fire, soil from the shore for earth, and water from the lake itself. As we prepared to head back into the water, Sarah grabbed my arm. "Maria," she said quietly, "if this doesn't work—" "It will," I said, cutting her off before she could finish. "It has to." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. We entered the water again, just as night fell. The lake seemed calmer now, like it was waiting for us. The massive figure had disappeared beneath the surface again, but I could feel its presence all around us. When we reached the altar, I placed the candles and soil on its surface while Jake poured water into a small hollow carved into the stone. The carvings began to glow faintly as if they were coming alive. I took out my notebook and read aloud the words I'd copied from the library book. The ancient language felt strange on my tongue, but I forced myself to keep going. As I spoke, the water around us began to ripple violently again. Shadows appeared in every direction, circling us like predators waiting for their moment to strike. "Keep going," Jake shouted over the noise. I raised my voice and continued chanting, even as fear threatened to overwhelm me. The carvings on. The altar glowed brighter now, casting an eerie light across the lake bed. And then, everything went still. The shadows froze in place as if they were listening, and then they turned toward me. I realized too late what was happening. The entity wasn't just being bound by the ritual, it was being drawn toward me. "No!" Jake shouted as he tried to pull me away from the altar, but it was too late. The shadows surged forward all at once, wrapping around me like cold tendrils of smoke. I felt a sharp pain in my chest as if something was being pulled out of me. My fear, my guilt, my very soul. But even as darkness closed in around me, I kept chanting. If this was what it took to stop the entity, to save everyone else, then so be it. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Jake and Sarah swimming away from the altar as light exploded outward from its surface. And then, silence. When I woke up, I was lying on the shore of Echo Lake with Jake and Sarah standing over me. The sun was rising in the distance, casting warm light across the water. "It's gone," Jake said quietly when he saw me open my eyes. "You did it." The lake looked different now. Calmer somehow, like whatever had been haunting it was finally at peace. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not completely. Echo Lake might be safe for now, but some things can never truly be destroyed. I lay there on the shore of Echo Lake, staring up at the sky as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. My body felt heavy, like I'd been drained of all my strength. Every part of me ached, but the pain in my chest was the worst. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, like a piece of me had been taken and left behind in that lake. Jake knelt beside me, his face pale but filled with relief. "Maria," he said softly, "you're alive." I nodded weakly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is it gone?" Sarah stood a few feet away, staring out at the water. "The lake's different now," she said quietly. "It feels still." I followed her gaze. The water was calm. No ripples, no shadows moving beneath the surface. It looked like any ordinary lake again. But I knew better. "It's not gone," I said finally, forcing myself to sit up. "It's bound. The ritual worked, but it's still there. Waiting." Jake frowned. "Waiting for what?" "For someone to break the balance again," I said. "For someone to disturb it." The three of us sat in silence for a long moment, watching the lake as the sun climbed higher into the sky. It looked so peaceful now, so harmless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, waiting for its chance to return. Over the next few days, life in the town slowly returned to normal. The sheriff issued an official statement about closing Echo Lake indefinitely, citing environmental concerns. People whispered about what had happened, about the strange lights and disappearances, but no one really knew the truth. Jake and Sarah left town soon after, promising to keep in touch. As for me, I stayed behind. I couldn't leave, not yet. I spent my days walking along the shore of Echo Lake, keeping an eye on its waters. Part of me hoped I'd never see those shadows again, but another part of me knew they were still there, just beneath the surface. One evening, as I sat by the water watching the sunset, I heard a faint sound. A whisper carried on the wind. Maria. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the lake. The water was still calm, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the sky above. But for a brief moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something move beneath its surface. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. My name is James Holloway. I'm not sure why I'm writing this down, but maybe it's because I need someone to know what really happened. You see, I've spent my life chasing stories, strange ones, the kind that most people dismiss as myths or legends. But this time was different. This wasn't just a story, it was real, and it almost cost me my life. It all started when I got a call about a small, forgotten town in the mountains called Blackwood Hollow. The place had always been quiet, tucked away from the rest of the world, but lately, something strange had been happening there. People were disappearing. Locals, hikers, even rescue teams who went looking for them. The reports said they vanished without a trace, leaving behind only scraps of clothing or belongings scattered in the snow. The locals whispered about an old legend, a creature they called the Wendigo. They said it was a spirit that preyed on humans, turning them into monsters if they got too close. I didn't believe in monsters, but I couldn't ignore the fact that something was out there. Something dangerous. I arrived at Blackwood Hollow on a cold winter evening. The town felt empty, like it was holding its breath. The streets were lined with old wooden houses that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Snow covered everything, muffling sound and making it hard to tell where one street ended and another began. The air was so cold it burned my lungs when I breathed. As I checked into the only inn in town, a creaky old building with faded wallpaper and a fireplace that barely gave off any heat, the innkeeper looked at me like she knew why I was there. "You're here about the disappearances," she said quietly, her voice trembling. I nodded. "What can you tell me?" She hesitated for a moment before leaning closer, her eyes darting around like she didn't want anyone to overhear us. "You should leave while you can," she whispered. "This place, it's cursed." I didn't respond right away. Cursed? That sounded ridiculous, but then again, so did people vanishing into thin air. That night, as I sat in my room looking out at the snow-covered mountains beyond the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending chills down my spine. For the first time in years, I felt uneasy about what I'd gotten myself into, but I wasn't going to back down. Not yet. I should probably tell you a little more about myself before I go on. Like I said, my name is James Holloway. I'm a freelance journalist, but not the kind that writes about politics or sports. I chase stories that most people don't want to believe. Ghost sightings, strange creatures, unexplained disappearances. Some call me crazy. Others think I'm just desperate for attention. But for me, it's never been about fame or money. It's about finding the truth. I wasn't always like this. A few years ago, I was just a regular guy with a regular job in a big city. Then something happened. Something I still don't like to talk about. Let's just say I saw something I couldn't explain, and it changed me forever. Since then, I've been obsessed with uncovering the things that hide in the shadows, the things most people are too scared to face. When I heard about Blackwood Hollow and the disappearances, I knew I had to go. It wasn't just another story to me. It felt personal. Maybe it was because of what happened to me all those years ago. Or maybe it was because deep down, I wanted to prove to myself that monsters aren't real. But as I sat in that cold, creaky inn on my first night in Blackwood Hollow, I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. The town felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet, like even the birds and animals were afraid to make a sound. And the way the locals looked at me, it was like they knew something terrible was coming but didn't want to say it out loud. The next morning, I decided to start asking questions. The innkeeper, her name was Mrs. Carter, wasn't much help. She just kept repeating that the town was cursed and begging me to leave before it was too late. So I went out into the town square, hoping to find someone else who would talk to me. That's when I met an old man named Henry. He was sitting on a bench near the frozen fountain, bundled up in layers of coats and scarves even though the sun was shining weakly through the clouds. When I introduced myself and told him why I was there, he gave me a long, hard look before finally speaking. "You're not going to find what you're looking for," he said in a voice so low I could barely hear him over the wind. "And if you do, you won't live to tell anyone about it." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Henry glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "This place, it's not like other places," he whispered. "There's something out there in the woods, something that doesn't belong here." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What kind of something?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "The Wendigo," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried not to roll my eyes. The Wendigo was just a legend, a story people told around campfires to scare each other. But Henry didn't seem like he was joking or trying to scare me for fun. He looked genuinely terrified. "People have been disappearing for years," he continued, his voice shaking now. "And every time it happens, we hear things at night, screams coming from deep in the woods." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and thanked him for his time. But as I walked away, his words stayed with me. Screams in the woods. It sounded ridiculous, but also exactly like the kind of thing that would get someone like me killed if I wasn't careful. I couldn't stop thinking about what Henry had said. Screams in the woods? A creature that didn't belong here? It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie, but the fear in his eyes was real. He truly believed it. And I couldn't ignore the fact that people were disappearing. Something was happening here, something I needed to figure out. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk through Blackwood Hollow to get a better sense of the place. The town was small, with only a handful of buildings scattered around the square. There was a diner, a tiny grocery store, and a church with a steeple that looked like it might collapse if the wind blew too hard. Most of the houses were old and empty, their windows boarded up or broken. As I walked down one of the side streets, I noticed a woman standing in her yard, staring at me. She looked like she wanted to say something but was too scared to approach me. I gave her a small nod and kept walking, but I could feel her eyes on me until I turned the corner. The woods were just beyond the edge of town, and as I got closer, I felt my chest tighten. There was something about those trees, something that made my skin crawl. They were tall and dark, their bare branches twisting together like they were trying to keep out the light. The snow on the ground was untouched, like no one had dared to step foot there in weeks. I stopped at the edge of the forest and stared into the shadows between the trees. For a moment, I thought I heard something. A faint rustling sound, like someone moving through the bushes. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there. I turned back toward town, but before I could take another step, I heard it again. The rustling sound. But this time, it was louder. My heart started pounding as I scanned the trees for any sign of movement. And then, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer, or maybe a wolf, but as it stepped out from behind one of the trees, I realized it wasn't anything normal. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were thin and twisted like branches. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were glowing. I froze in place as it stared at me from across the clearing. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with those glowing eyes. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this what Henry had been talking about? Was this the Wendigo? Suddenly, it let out a low growl, a sound so deep and guttural that it felt like it was vibrating through my chest, and then it disappeared back into the shadows. I didn't wait to see where it went. I turned and ran back toward town as fast as I could, my boots slipping on the icy ground. By the time I reached Mrs. Carter's inn, my lungs were burning and my hands were shaking. "What happened?" she asked when she saw me burst through the door. I think I saw it," I stammered. Her face went pale as she grabbed my arm and pulled me closer to her. "You need to leave," she whispered urgently. "You need to leave now." But I couldn't leave, not yet, whatever that thing was. It wasn't just a legend anymore. It was real, and if I didn't figure out what it wanted, or how to stop it, more people were going to disappear. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The pale skin, the twisted limbs, and those glowing eyes staring right through me. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. And it was out there, waiting. The next morning, I decided to do some digging. If I was going to figure out what was happening in Blackwood Hollow, I needed answers. I started by asking around town, but most people refused to talk to me. They either ignored me completely, or muttered something about not wanting to get involved. It was like they were all too scared to even say the word Wendigo. Finally, I found someone who was willing to talk, a young man named Caleb who worked at the grocery store. I seemed nervous but curious, like he wanted to help, but wasn't sure if he should. "I've heard stories," he said quietly as we sat in the back of the store, away from anyone who might overhear us. "My grandfather used to tell me about it when I was a kid." "What kind of stories?" I asked. Caleb hesitated for a moment before answering. He said the Wendigo is a spirit, a curse that comes when people get too greedy or desperate. It takes over their bodies and turns them into monsters. They're always hungry, but no matter how much they eat, they can never be full. I felt a chill run down my spine as he spoke. "Do you think that's what's happening here?" I asked. He shrugged nervously. "I don't know, but people have been disappearing for years, long before you got here, and every time it happens, we hear things in the woods." "What kind of things?" I pressed. "Screams," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and thanked him for his time. But as I left the store and stepped back into the cold winter air, I couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb knew more than he was letting on. That evening, I decided to go back to the woods, this time prepared. I packed a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook in case I found anything worth documenting. Mrs. Carter tried to stop me as I left the inn, but I told her I'd be fine. She didn't look convinced. The woods were even darker than they had been before, and every step felt heavier than the last. The snow crunched under my boots as I made my way deeper into the trees, my flashlight cutting through the shadows like a knife. For a while, everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. And I started to wonder if maybe I'd imagined everything after all. But then, I heard it. It started as a faint sound in the distance, like someone crying, but as I got closer it turned into something else entirely. It wasn't crying anymore. It was screaming, blood-curdling screams that echoed through the trees and sent chills down my spine. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to figure out where the sound was coming from. And then, I saw it again. The Wendigo stepped out from behind one of the trees, its glowing eyes locking onto mine as it let out another low growl. This time, though, it didn't disappear right away. It started moving toward me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I tried to keep it steady. The creature moved slowly at first, but then it picked up speed, its twisted limbs carrying it across the snow like it was gliding instead of running. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in short gasps as panic took over. The screams grew louder behind me, mixing with the sound of branches snapping and snow crunching underfoot. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town and collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. My legs felt like they were on fire and my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold on to my flashlight. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a legend anymore. It was real, and it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of frantic knocking on my door. It was Mrs. Carter, her face pale and her hands trembling as she held on to the doorframe. "They found another one," she said, her voice barely audible. "Another hiker. Gone." I jumped out of bed and quickly got dressed. By the time I made it outside, a small group of locals had gathered near the edge of town. They were talking in hushed voices, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. Henry was there too, sitting on the same bench near the frozen fountain, staring at the woods like he was waiting for something. "What happened?" I asked one of the men in the group. He shook his head grimly. "We found his backpack near the trail this morning. No sign of him anywhere." I felt a lump form in my throat as I looked toward the forest. The snow-covered trees seemed even darker than before, their shadows stretching across the ground like they were trying to pull us in. "We need to go after him," I said firmly. "He might still be alive." The group exchanged nervous glances before one of them finally spoke up. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "No one who goes into those woods comes back." I refused to accept that. If there was even a chance that this hiker was still alive, we had to try. After some convincing and a lot of hesitation, 3 men agreed to join me in a search party. We packed supplies and headed toward the trail where the backpack had been found. As we stepped into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed closer together now, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The air was cold and heavy, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of snow under our boots, the rustling of leaves in the wind. We followed the trail for what felt like hours, calling out the hiker's name every few minutes. But there was no response, just silence, broken occasionally by distant sounds that made my skin crawl. And then, we found something. It wasn't the hiker. It was another backpack, torn and covered in blood. One of the men picked it up and turned it over in his hands, his face pale as he inspected it. "This isn't right," he muttered under his breath. Before I could ask what he meant, we heard it, the same blood-curdling scream I'd heard before. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off every surface until it felt like it was coming from all around us. "Run!" one of the men shouted, dropping the backpack and bolting back toward town. But before any of us could move, it appeared. The Wendigo. It stepped out from behind a tree, its glowing eyes fixed on us as it let out another low growl. This time, it wasn't alone. There were 2 of them. The men panicked and started running in different directions, shouting for help as they disappeared into the trees. I tried to follow them, but my legs felt like lead as fear took over us. One by one, their screams faded into silence until I was alone. Just me and the Wendigos. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. The creatures didn't move right away. They just stood there, watching me with those glowing eyes like they were deciding what to do next. And then, they lunged. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in short gasps as branches whipped against my face and snow flew up around me. My flashlight slipped from my hand and landed in the snow behind me, but I didn't stop to grab it. I couldn't stop. By some miracle, I made it back to town without being caught. But when I turned around to look at the woods one last time, they were gone. The search party never returned. Not even their bodies were found. And just like that, Blackwood Hollow lost 3 more souls to whatever was hiding in those woods. After the failed rescue attempt, everything changed. The town felt heavier, like it was sinking under the weight of its own fear. People stopped leaving their homes entirely, and the streets became eerily empty. Even Mrs. Carter, who had always been kind to me, avoided looking me in the eye when I passed her in the hallway. I couldn't blame them. 3 men were gone, 3 lives lost, and I had no answers. The guilt was crushing. I kept replaying that moment in my head, the screams, the glowing eyes, the way they lunged at us like predators hunting their prey. I should have done something. I should have stopped them. But instead, I ran. I spent most of my time locked in my room at the inn, trying to make sense of what had happened. My notebook was filled with scribbled notes and sketches of the creatures, but none of it helped. Every time I tried to piece together a theory, it fell apart under the weight of what I'd seen. The Wendigos weren't just legends. They were real, and they were hunting people. One night, as I sat by the window staring out at the snow-covered streets, I heard something, a faint sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a voice. It sounded distant and muffled, but I could make out a few words. "Help, please." My heart skipped a beat as I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside. The cold hit me like a wall as I stepped into the street, but I didn't care. If someone was out there, if someone needed help, I couldn't ignore it. The voice grew louder as I approached the edge of town, pulling me toward the trees like a magnet. "Help, please." It repeated, each word laced with desperation. But as I stepped into the woods, something felt off. The air was colder here, so cold that it hurt to breathe, and the shadows seemed darker than usual. The voice sounded close now, but when I looked around, there was no one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. And then, laughter. It started as a low chuckle but quickly grew louder and more distorted until it echoed through the trees like a chorus of voices overlapping each other. My blood ran cold as realization hit me. This wasn't a person calling for help. It was them. I turned to run back toward town, but before I could take a step, they appeared. 2 Wendigos stepping out from behind the trees like they'd been waiting for me all along. Their glowing eyes burned into mine as they let out low growls that sent chills down my spine. This time, though, I didn't run. Not right away. Something inside me snapped as I stared at them. Something primal and desperate. These creatures had taken everything from this town, its people, its safety, its sanity, and now they were trying to take me too. I wasn't going to let them win. I grabbed a fallen branch from the ground and held it in front of me like a weapon. It wasn't much, it wouldn't stop them, but it made me feel less helpless. "Come on," I shouted, my voice shaking but loud enough to echo through the trees. "You want me? Come get me." The Wendigos tilted their heads slightly, almost like they were confused by my sudden defiance, but then they started moving toward me again. Slowly at first, then faster with each step. I swung the branch wildly as they lunged at me, but it barely slowed them down. Their twisted limbs moved unnaturally fast as they circled around me like wolves closing in on their prey. Just when I thought it was over, just when their glowing eyes were inches away from mine, I heard something. A loud crack followed by a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath my feet. An avalanche. The snow came crashing down from the mountains above us like a tidal wave, swallowing everything in its path, including the Wendigos. I barely managed to escape before the snow buried me too, stumbling back toward town with my heart pounding and my legs shaking uncontrollably. When I finally made it back to Mrs. Carter's inn and collapsed onto the floor inside, she rushed over to help me up. "What happened?" she asked urgently. "They're gone," I whispered hoarsely. "At least for now." But even as she helped me to my room and tried to reassure me that everything would be okay, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. The avalanche had bought me time, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. The Wendigos weren't gone. They were just waiting. And if I didn't do something soon, they would come back. They always did. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what to do. The locals had stopped talking to me completely, and even Mrs. Carter seemed distant now. It was like they'd already given up, like they were just waiting for the inevitable. But I couldn't give up. Not yet. I started researching everything I could find about Wendigos, digging through old books and online forums for any clue that might help me stop them. Most of what I found was useless, just stories and myths. But one thing kept coming up over and over again: fire. According to legend, Wendigos feared fire more than anything else. It was the only thing that could destroy them completely, the only thing that could break their curse. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, I packed everything I needed: a lighter, a canister of gasoline I found in the inn's storage room, and a few torches I made from broken furniture. Mrs. Carter tried to stop me as I headed toward the door, but I shook my head firmly. "I have to do this," I said quietly. "If I don't, they'll keep coming." She didn't say anything. She just nodded and stepped aside, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. The woods were darker than ever as I stepped inside, my flashlight barely cutting through the shadows. Every sound made me jump: the rustling of leaves, the crunch of snow under my boots. But I forced myself to keep going. I didn't have a plan. Not really. All I knew was that I had to find them before they found me. For hours, I wandered through the trees, calling out to them like I was daring them to show themselves. "Come on!" I shouted into the darkness. "I know you're out there." At first, there was nothing, just silence. But then, they answered. It started with a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once, followed by the sound of branches snapping in the distance. My heart pounded as I gripped one of my torches tightly in my hand, waiting for them to appear. And then, they did. 2 Wendigos stepped out from behind the trees, their glowing eyes burning into mine as they let out guttural snarls that sent chills down my spine. They moved slowly at first, almost like they were taunting me, but then they lunged. I lit the torch just in time and swung it wildly in front of me, the flames casting eerie shadows across their twisted bodies. They recoiled slightly at the sight of the fire but didn't retreat. They were too hungry for that. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice trembling as I held the torch out in front of me like a shield. They circled around me cautiously now, their movements slower but no less threatening. Every time one of them got too close, I swung the torch toward them again, forcing them to step back into the shadows. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I reached for the gasoline canister and poured it onto the ground around me in a wide circle before lighting it with my torch. The flames roared to life instantly, creating a barrier between me and them. For a moment, they hesitated, almost like they were afraid. But then one of them let out an ear-piercing scream and charged straight through the fire toward me. I stumbled backward as it lunged at me with its twisted limbs, barely managing to dodge its attack before swinging my torch directly at its face. The flames caught onto its pale skin instantly, spreading across its body like wildfire as it let out another scream, this time one of pain. The second Wendigo tried to attack while I was distracted, but I grabbed another torch from my bag and threw it at its feet before lighting it with my lighter. The flames spread quickly again, engulfing its body as it thrashed wildly against the snow-covered ground. By the time it was over, by the time both creatures had stopped moving, I was shaking so badly that I could barely stand. The fire had done its job. It had destroyed them completely. But at what cost? As I stumbled back toward town, with smoke still rising from the woods behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really over. Not yet. When I finally made it. Back to Blackwood Hollow, the town was completely silent. The streets were empty, the houses dark, and even the wind seemed to have stopped. It felt like the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stumbled into Mrs. Carter's inn, my clothes soaked with sweat and snow, my hands trembling so badly I could barely close the door behind me. She was waiting for me in the lobby, her face pale and her eyes wide with worry. "Did you?" she started to ask, but I cut her off with a nod. "They're gone," I said quietly. "At least for now." She didn't say anything. She just nodded slowly, and helped me upstairs to my room. As I collapsed onto the bed, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The Wendigos were gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really over. The next morning, a search party went into the woods to look for any sign of the missing men, or what was left of them. They found nothing, no bodies, no blood, not even a scrap of clothing. It was like they had vanished into thin air. The fire had destroyed everything in its path, the trees, the snow, and whatever was left of the Wendigos. But it hadn't erased what had happened. The town still felt haunted, like it was carrying the weight of all the lives that had been lost. I stayed in Blackwood Hollow for a few more days, trying to make sense of everything. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something waiting for me to leave so it could come back. Before I left, Henry stopped me in the street. He looked different now, less scared, more resigned. "You did what you could," he said simply. "But this place, it'll never be free." I wanted to argue with him, to tell him that he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he was right. Blackwood Hollow wasn't just cursed, it was trapped in a cycle of fear and death that couldn't be broken. As I drove away from the town and back toward civilization, I couldn't help but glance at the woods in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. Even now, as I sit here writing this down, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting for their next victim. Maybe Henry was right. Maybe Blackwood Hollow will never be free, or maybe neither will I.